we're going to be teaching into an area with some descendants which I don't think I've ever heard. In fact, if I mention the names, Perez, anyone know anything about Perez? His son Hezron and his son Ram. These are the son, the grandson and the great-grandson of Judah. Okay, one of the members of the original tribe of Israel, one of the sons of Jacob. So these people in the Bible are actually only mentioned in genealogy. And the genealogy is not just in one place, funnily enough, but it's in some other books. So we'll just open. But the point of this is that when we read the Bible, we tend to read stories. We can read sections of the Bible, and the main character where we're at the moment is Joseph. And yet these other people are alive. And so we sometimes miss them and miss their story, but they're so important that they're actually the forefathers of Jesus himself. And yet the Bible doesn't give a story that has their name in it. But they were there. And so to bring them to life, we look at the lives they led in the circumstances that was going on around them. And I bring to bear a little bit of context through history to actually put it into order, I guess, and to explain the connection to the genealogy of Jesus and why it's written that way. So just to start with, in the genealogy of Jesus, the verse 3 talks about 3 generations of Israelites, as I mentioned. So it reads, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. So that's from Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. So we see that grouping. So one of the things I mentioned when we first started this series is that every verse in the genealogy of Jesus has grouped the descendants according to their circumstances. And so we find that we're at this point in time, we've passed through the patriarchs, and Judah has led his family inadvertently, via Joseph, down into the land of Egypt. So we find here that they're moving down into a time of famine, and yet the Bible tells us that they're going to prosper. And so they've been set apart amongst other people. So this is all contained in this verse. In verse 4, which we'll carry on from there next, we see a reversal of circumstances where the prosperity comes to an end, Joseph's life comes to an end, and suddenly this great nation of people that have grown and prospered have become an offence to the Egyptians because they realise that they've become wealthy. Right? In last week's lesson we talked about how they were given the best of the land in Goshen. So here we have this land in famine, and we find that they've actually been given the best of the land. Right? So we're going to go through this and examine this, and you'll see the parts of the Bible come and knit together, which will explain their time. So Perez was born in the land of Canaan. So I mentioned last week, when Judah went down, Perez went down, his son Hezron went down, and his Perez went down. That's right. Judah went down. Jacob went down. Perez went down, and Hezron went down. So there's 4 generations that went down together. Right? So the next generation that finishes off this and starts the next verse is actually Ram, and Ram was the first child or descendant that was actually born in the land of Egypt. So all of these descendants, and Perez included, was born in the land of Canaan. He was the son of Judah and his son's widow Tamar. He was born a twin, whilst his brother Zerah's hand reached out of the womb first. It was Perez who was born first. This is why he was named Perez. Does anyone remember this? Bit of a stretch? Yeah, right. So his name actually means breaking out. Okay, so he actually ended up coming out or being born first. So Perez, as I said, he's not credited with a direct story, although he's mentioned, funnily enough, does anyone know where else he's mentioned? I'll ask the question. Apart from the genealogy of Jesus, where else is he mentioned in the Bible? This will test where you read your Bible, the details. It's actually mentioned in the book of Ruth. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? So, he's mentioned in the book of Ruth 5 generations later when his descendant Boaz agrees to marry a Moabite woman named Ruth. In Ruth chapter 4, verse 12, it reads, "May the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman make your family like the family of Perez, the son of Judah and Tamar." Well, that's a bit unusual, isn't it? May he make your family like the family of Perez. So if you know the story of Boaz and Ruth, why do you think there's this alignment with this descendant Perez?
Maybe similar situation?
Similar situation. So we understand the story of Judah and Tamar, Perez's birth. So he was actually the firstborn. He was born in a circumstance where perhaps it should never have happened, obviously. So we find that there's unique circumstances. Judah wasn't walking with the Lord at the time. There's another circumstance. So we see this comment which draws one part of the Bible to the next part. We would never read or pick up on this sort of stuff, but when we look at them from this descendant's point of view, we see this. So having a look at that, Boaz obviously is a future descendant who, like Judah, is an older man of a different generation who has children with a younger woman. So we have the older generation with the younger generation having children. Both women are widows. Remember the scripture says, "May the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman make your family like the family of Perez." So we see this alignment of a young woman. Both women are widows and both men take responsibility for them. So we know that because Judah had children by Tamar, even though his daughter-in-law, he was obliged to take care of them. Okay? Under the laws, he was obliged, he had no choice, he had to take care of them. Okay? So we'll go into some of that further on a bit later. So the book of Ruth provides a genealogical statement, and it goes on and it says in verses 18 to 22 in Ruth 4, "This then is the family line of Perez." So it's funny, isn't it? When we read the Bible, we find out more from other books often than the position of the story in the Bible itself. And here we have this again. "This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Aminadab, Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David." So what do you think is going on there? Genealogy always has a purpose. The end result is he is connected to whom? To David. So this takes you all the way from Perez right through to David. What's part of the blessing that was given to Judah? In Genesis 49, he was told,
the line of Judah is going to come. The line is going to come through him. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
and it talked about the scepter and the rod of rule. Okay, so here we have this connection being made from Perez all the way through to King David, which fulfills a genealogical pathway. But what it actually does is actually fulfills part of the promise of the prophecy that the covenant will pass through him all the way through to King David.
But wasn't it also mentioned in Ruth to validate Ruth?
There is a validation because they talk about them being in similar circumstances, so correct. But what else it tells us about? It tells us about the nature of people. It tells you that these people, even though they had issues that were not righteous by God, it didn't stop the genealogical path, the promise of the covenant passing through them. So no matter what happened to every person in every generation, God will fulfill his part of his covenant. And we've talked about this before, where someone does something and the path goes astray, but it always comes back to where it should be, no matter what happens. And so we find these people, they're now down in Egypt. What's the land of the covenant? Canaan. Well, they just left there. So if this is the land of the covenant, Joseph was sent down to Egypt, they take all the family out of the land whatsoever, so they're now no longer even in the land of promise. So we see there's a purpose in all of this. There's a pathway that's happening. And so God's purpose is different to perhaps how we would see it, isn't it? He knows there's a reason for all this happening, and we're obviously going to open this door as we look. Now his name is also listed in another genealogy called the descendants of Judah, and that's found in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 4 to 5, under the family tree of King David, funnily enough. So we've got David here, King David, family tree. 1 Chronicles 2:9, the family tree of King David. And then again, of course, in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, which we started. So for someone who has no story in the Bible, Perez is actually mentioned continuously in these genealogical parts. But they have different connections. But the main connection we can see is it actually goes through to King David. It's the dominant thing. So Perez's journey is measured, if you will, in the pathway that's going to connect through to King David, who fulfills the blessing of the Lord that was given to Judah, that the ruler would come through him. We're talking about the earthly rulers, of course, the pathway of the kings, and we're ultimately talking about Jesus the Messiah, who would be the eternal ruler. Okay? So we see in every little detail there's this path and this connection that passes through Scripture. Here we are back in the Old Testament. These family, which was a bit of a shambles, who are fighting each other, end up in Egypt, and we find that God's plan is still passing through all of this stuff. He has a purpose in it. So we look at Perez and we look at his family, we can sort of stitch together what's going on in his life. So the first thing we know is that they went to the land of Goshen. So last week when we had a look, why did they go to the land of Goshen? Anyone remember?
Famine in the land.
Famine in the land, but why Goshen?
It's right in the it's in the Nile Valley, and it was very fertile ground, and they were gracious. They had sheep and cattle.
Right.
Yeah.
But was there something more that was said? Was it there was something that was said?
There's a river-like thingy.
Yes, but there was something that was predetermined. Right? When Joseph met, he told Judah that he was to say to the pharaoh that you're shepherds. And the reason was because shepherds were detestable to the Egyptians. So he knew that by so doing they say, well, you go and live over there. But Joseph actually suggested the where. So they ended up in the best of the land. They had grazing, they had water, they had their own area, and yet they were fulfilling exactly what they understood the Pharaoh would think and do before they actually did it. And who was in there doing all of this? Joseph. He was engineering and orchestrating all of this stuff. He told his own family, this is what you are to say to the Pharaoh, and this is what the Pharaoh says. So when he introduced them, the Pharaoh said, you go there because you're detestable. And then they said, thank you. And off they went. So we have this extraordinary situation. So I'll just pass it around again just for a refresh. But we have this map which I've passed around before. We'll put this up on the YouTube video. It's just a refresh so you can see where Joseph was. Joseph was in the city of On, which is called Heliopolis today. But Goshen, and Avarice as it was called then, it wasn't called Ramses because Ramses didn't exist at this point in time. It was called Avarice. So these were two locations that were apart from each other. So when they settled in the land of Egypt, the brothers and the father and the family were not with Joseph. They were not with his sons or his wife Asenath. So Ephraim, Manasseh, Asenath, the father-in-law, who was the high priest of Ammon, all those people were in the city of On with Joseph, where he ruled from. When they went down to the land, it was the second year of the famine. There was 5 years of famine still yet to happen. And so while the famine was happening, they're there in this prosperous land while everywhere else is actually being devastated. So again, we can see God's hand on this situation. So we know that Perez, like all of them, was a shepherd. He would grow up as a shepherd. They went there, they had tents, they had their animals, and they would have started there. We know later on in the Bible that they started to build dwellings because they were there for a long time. But initially when they first went down, they were tent people. They came from the land of Canaan with tents. So like his father, he joined the men tending the flocks and the herds of his family, and at the start of his teenage years, he would have been growing up and being able to see things for himself. He would have realised there's no rain, the living conditions were appalling, and so he would have realised that there was this issue that they were there for a reason as his fathers, and I say fathers meaning generations, would have been teaching them that the Lord's brought us down here. Joseph is taking care of it. So he would have grown up underneath that mantle of protection. So we had enough feed for the animals, need to be fed from the grain reserve. Things would have been getting low everywhere else, and yet they were in this land where they had plenty. So they would have been noticing, they would have had to notice there's something, we're set apart. In Perez's case, his uncle is taking care of the country. We're here in the good land, and yet everywhere they look around, all the Egyptians, they would have been starving. The only thing they could get was the grain reserve that came from their uncle. So this set them apart. So his grandfather, so I'm talking in relation to Perez, so we're talking generation by generation, so I want you to go into the mindset of Perez. So his grandfather Jacob called his father Judah and all of his uncles together, and in Genesis 42 verses 1 to 2, he asked them, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard there is grain in Egypt." So we talked about this on the previous lesson. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. So we're going back a little step. Starvation became a real threat. Benjamin was his uncle. Right? His uncle Benjamin was not allowed to go. So they're all living together. He would have seen this. Perez would have understood. His grandfather was very nervous about sending him away because his uncle Joseph had been killed. That's what he would have thought. Remember, he's born in the land of Canaan. Benjamin was his only uncle left, who was born by his grandmother's sister Rachel. Perez never knew her, for she had died in childbirth before he was born, but his grandfather missed her terribly. So this would have been his take on the situation. I've dated to 1708 BC that he would have farewelled his father. His uncles and their entourage set out with the provisions, very minimal, to go down to Egypt. So you can imagine his perspective is all of his uncles are going. They're going off to a foreign land. He wouldn't know where it was. They're at home starving. So that was his position. So it would have been tough for him to see them go. He wouldn't have known what to expect, like the rest of them. They were gone for about 2.5 months. And so they would have been waiting day by day by day of news. When are they coming back? What's going on? So that would have been his position. So suddenly they would have come back. He would have seen the heavily laden donkeys, and they would have all run out as children to greet them, wouldn't they? So he would have greeted his father. Of course, his father is Judah. And they would have noticed, where's Uncle Simeon? He's gone. He's not back with them. And so all of the family would have noticed this. So obviously they would have been concerned and wanting to know what happened. They would find out that Simeon had been detained in Egypt, and Jacob would never risk letting his uncle Benjamin go down to Egypt. So they had food at this point in time. His uncle has disappeared, and he would have been there in this family realising that his grandfather is upset. He's lost another son. And so this would be his norm. They would have known Joseph only as Zaphnath-Paneah. They would have come back and said, "We spoke to Zaphnath-Paneah. He took our uncle away from us. But we came back and oh my goodness, we've got all this grain, but the money's back in the bags. Something's wrong." So there would have been a lot of consternation around what was happening. But obviously as time went, the famine didn't pass, and the Egyptians didn't come after his uncles. Remember when they left, they were worried they would come after them. So in Genesis 43, 1-2, it says, "Now the famine was still severe in the land, so when they had eaten all of the grain," so I'm talking about the context, which I did in the previous lessons, from their position now. "So when they'd eaten all the grain they had brought from Egypt, their father," which is his grandfather Jacob, "said to them, 'Go back and buy us a little more food.'" Obviously his father would have been distressed, because last time he went down and negotiated, he lost his brother. And he told Zaphnath-Paneah that they wouldn't see him again unless they brought down their uncle Benjamin, in verse 3. So how could he return otherwise? So his father turned to his grandfather in verse 5 and said, "But if you will not send him," meaning Benjamin, "we will not go down." Remember, he's the son. He would have had this swirling around him. He would know exactly what's going on. But they're all hungry. They're starving. They're running out of grain. So his father had made his point, but if they did not go, then they would all perish. So of course his grandfather concedes and instructs his uncles to take twice as much money and some gifts with them this time, for he didn't want anything more to go wrong. So they set off again, this time with their uncle Benjamin, and obviously just surviving. You can imagine they've gone for a long time, they've run out of grain, and so they would have been panicking. Their circumstances would have been really, really dire. Now, the next thing, we learn that Perez had children before he went down to Egypt. So he was married, and his wife had given him a son called Hezron, which is the next generation. So now he would have reason concern for his family, for his wife and his son, because he's actually unable to provide to them as a father as well. So that's his position. So they didn't have any choices. So another 2.5 months passed. His uncle Benjamin had gone with his father, his other uncles, and so they would have been all worried. And his father had personally guaranteed the safety of his uncle Benjamin. In verse 9 of Genesis 43, Judah, it said, "I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all in my life." So his father's putting himself out as a bit of a sacrificial lamb at this point in time. But we know from the story they did return, and they were all there, and the governor of Egypt, Zaphnath-Paneah, had kept his word, so they would have been all overjoyed. So when they arrived back, what would he have seen? The Bible tells us that when they returned, they had what? Has anyone read this? They had clothes given to them by the Egyptians. So suddenly they would have been dressed differently to how they left. The Egyptians also gave them carts to bring the family back, and they had all of the food. But they didn't just have the grain. Joseph gave them food, other food as well, provisions. Okay? So when they came back, you would have seen these beautifully crafted Egyptian carts, and he would have seen his brothers differently, plus all the provisions. So before anyone could ask his questions, his uncles went up to his grandfather and told him, what did they say? In verse 26 of Genesis 45, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler over all of Egypt." So this is the story from the land of Canaan, their context, because they weren't there during the rest of it. So of course his grandfather was stunned, wasn't he? Jacob was almost in disbelief at the beginning, because he was constantly being told things when they weren't true. And so he would have been questioning this. So he would have asked how this can be. So his grandfather refused to believe them because of this reason. And he'd not forgotten the moment when they handed him Joseph's robe, torn and bloodied. He would never have forgotten that. So his father and his uncles told his grandfather everything Joseph had said to them. Then there was the donkeys loaded with, the Bible says in verse 23 of Genesis 45, the best things of Egypt. So it wasn't just the grain, there was a lot of other gifts that came along with it as well. So they would have noticed all of this wealth there in squalor, and here they come back with all of these gifts. So the carts and the provisions had been sent back with Jacob, their wives and their children, so they were being taken back down to the land of Egypt. This was the purpose. So we get to this point now where this is their story we can piece together in the land of Canaan from their point of view, and suddenly he, his wife and his son and the rest of the extended family with these carts are all going down to Egypt. So they're off on an adventure which he wouldn't have had any expectations, because he's never been anywhere else to live. Now the Bible tells us that Perez had 2 children when he went down to the land of Egypt. So that means before he went, they would have had the second child, and the second child was called Hamul. So when you look up Hamul, it actually means spared or pitied, is what the name means. not surprising considering their predicament. So if we look at the circumstances with which they were living, worried about his son dying, starving, he's named this boy, please Lord, take pity on my son, please spare us. That's what would have been going on. They would have been praying. In the book of Genesis, in verse 8 of Genesis 46, it says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his descendants, who went to Egypt, as the sons of Perez." And then it says Hezron and Ram in verse 12. They were among the youngest to go from the tribe of Israel, for only other children of the generation was his uncle Asher's grandsons. So there's only one other that had grandchildren. So it gives you a picture of the family. So the tribe of Israel, they left Mamre, which is near Hebron today, from the land of Canaan. And it says here, the Bible told us that Jacob knew that his eyes would be closed by his son Joseph in the land of Egypt. So when the grandfather of the family is going down, he knows he's not coming back, or not coming back alive.
Yeah.
Right? So he knew he was going to die in the presence of Joseph. So in Genesis 46:4, as I mentioned, it says, "Joseph's own hand will close your eyes," is what God told him. So he knew he was not coming back alive. So Perez, on the other hand, knew not how long he was going to be away, or whether he would even return. They didn't know what was going to happen, but he was grateful, obviously, that God's provision was going to keep his family alive. So God's covenant provided that the future Messiah would come from the seed of his son Hezron. This is significant. Their life was under quite a severe stress, and yet we find that they were all kept alive. So of course they went back. They were a bit privileged. They had carts and all the rest of it, so they would have been more comfortable going back as the whole tribe. And obviously when they went to Egypt, they would have noticed all of the differences that were there, the forts along the way, etc. Now the Bible tells us that his grandfather, so we're talking about Jacob, urged his father Judah to travel ahead to meet with his uncle Joseph, so they could get directions to find their way to Goshen, where they would stay. So of course he would have bid his father farewell and remain behind with his family. His job, of course, was he was a shepherd, so he would have had to look after the livestock while his father went off. So once they got down to the Nile Delta, his father Judah returned and guided them to where they were to meet with their uncle Joseph. He wondered what he would be like. Obviously, he's never met him before. And when they arrived, his uncle Joseph, of course, he rode in on a chariot. Right, so he's not familiar with any of these things. He's never seen these things before. So it would have been an impressive sight, regaled in the clothes of an Egyptian, dressed in fine linen, wore a chain around his neck, the signet ring of authority on his finger, which Genesis 41 verses 42 to 43 explains. People bowed before him as he made his way, but Joseph only had eyes for his father, and it says in Genesis 46:29, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. So I've got another picture here, a beautiful illustration which puts all the period costume in. This is what Joseph would have looked like. So he would have been on his chair. He was treated as the pharaoh. Pass that around, have a look. He would have had the bearers, the people carrying him. That chair that he's on, you can go to museums in Cairo and you can see that very chair.
Yeah.
Exactly the styling of that is done from those ancient chairs that the pharaohs used. Right, he would have been carried. He would have had the canopy above his head. He would have had the men there with the fans. And in fact, they carried a canopy that surrounded the whole lot of them. So he was in utter comfort being carried on the shoulders of other men. So when we look at Joseph in the Bible, when you look at that picture, you see what he looked like as Zaphanath-Paneah. He appeared like an Egyptian. He was honoured like an Egyptian. He was revered because people bowed to him as an Egyptian. And so you can imagine when he rocks up on his chariot and his family are come out of the tent in Canaan starving, and there's his uncle dressed in gold, fine linen, being carried. So extraordinary difference between the two. So you can imagine as Perez, he would have been pretty excited seeing all of this stuff. Their family would have had all this joy and probably a lot of questions they would have wanted to ask. So in Genesis 46:30, it says his grandfather's love for his uncle Joseph was obvious. He said to him, "Now I am able to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." So obviously Jacob's hope in all of his life was that he would see his son Joseph again. And so now here he is. He says, I'm going to die a happy man. I'm at peace. So Joseph turned from his father and he dressed them all. And again, all in the Bible, in Genesis 46 verses 31 to 34. And he says, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were living in the land of Canaan have come to me. This is what I was talking about earlier. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. So Joseph is telling his family what he's going to say to the Pharaoh. When Pharaoh calls you in, so he's telling them that Pharaoh is going to get them to come before him and ask, what is your occupation? Now he tells them, this is what you are to answer. He says, you should answer. He says, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. So we get this very worldly context of what it's like to live in Egypt and why they end up in the land of Goshen. So Joseph was all over this situation. So Joseph selected, the Bible tells us, 5 of the uncles to go with him. So Judah, the father Perez, when he returned, he told of how they explained to the Pharaoh. So this is from Perez's point of view. So he would have come back and told them all the events that actually transpired. That they were shepherd, asked for permission to settle in Goshen, and they would have been overjoyed when they found out that this request was granted. So what a great day. God's purpose for sending Joseph ahead to Egypt had come to pass. 4 generations of Abraham's descendants had arrived together, each of them the seeds through whom the Messiah would come in the future. That's pretty extraordinary. 4 generations going down together, each of them listed in the genealogy of Jesus, from whom the Messiah would come. So for the next 5 years, the famine continued, and whilst the Egyptian people suffered and gave up all for their Pharaoh, Perez and all the tribe of Judah continued to prosper in the best of the land. When Joseph, Zaphnath-Paneah, governing the nation they lived in, they were secure from any imminent threat. So he would be a form of protection for them. He would be always looking out for them, making sure that they were okay. So in 1702, by the dating, the famine entered. So we find at this point in time, the fulfilment of God's plan has come to fruition. They're all down in the land of Egypt. They're in the area of plenty. The famine has drawn to an end. Joseph's hand on the situation allowed, or in fact more than that, directed what would actually happen. Now when we look at history, I spoke about this last week. We talked about Pharaoh Amenhotep I, who was the son of Pharaoh Ahmose I. Now Amenhotep was a child pharaoh. So in history, with the dating that I'm talking about, there's no coincidence, but the year that the famine ended, he actually came of age. So if you think about this, God placed him in the land. He was there to govern the land. He took over the family. The Bible says that he was lord over the family. So he mastered over the household. Right? He ruled the kingdom. And here we find in the same year that the famine ended, that the child Pharaoh came of age and was able to take the throne again. And so the child's mother, Ahmose Nefertari, she would step down as the regent, and the responsibilities of ruling would have gone to the boy again. So it's almost like ticking a box and saying Joseph's job was done. It was complete. It's quite extraordinary. So obviously Perez was blessed and the covenant was protected. So that's what I've been able to piece together of Perez's journey. And the change of Pharaoh aligns with the end of the time of the famine, historically. So we sort of get this dovetailing. So we move now to Hezron. Remember his story, he was alive as well in the land of Canaan. Right, so he was born there, but he grew up in Egypt. He would have been much younger. He fathers 3 sons. They're called Hezron, Ram, who's the second son, and Caleb. So we find out once again that it's not always the first son that becomes the next descendant in the genealogy of Jesus, and here we find this again. It says later in life he marries Micaiah's daughter, and the great granddaughter of Joseph. So that's the family connection. From whom he fathers a son called Segub when he was 60. So that's just a little bit of information, because the Bible doesn't give us very much. Right? So arriving in Egypt, Hezron would have only been an infant. He would have been young, very young. So every generation of Abraham's descendants, we learn, were sinners. They had a sin nature. As we travel from Abraham through all of them, we find that circumstances where they walked away from the Lord and they came back. The inheritance of God's covenant passing from father to firstborn was broken. So we keep mentioning this, that it's not always the firstborn. The Lord said the first son should receive the inheritance. But we find out this is constantly being broken. So from the time God called Abraham to the birth of the nation of Israel, his covenant was broken by sin at the end of the day. But we know that he is a merciful father. He punishes his children with love. He put them through trial and tribulation until they humbled themselves and asked for forgiveness. He rescued them, restored them back into relationship, and rewarded them with prosperity and peace. So what we're talking about here is that the brothers were not unified in the land of Canaan, the next generation. They were fighting each other, they were willing to kill Joseph, and so they were not going to birth a nation in that very way. So when they got put into trial, they got moved country, they were starving together. What happened? They went down to Joseph and they confessed their sin. This is happening. God's doing this to us because of what we did to Joseph. So we find that this whole journey, part of God's plan, is to bring these brothers to a point of repentance for their sin. And so this changes their life and knits them together. Right? No longer are they in control. They're now bowing before Joseph, fulfilling the very vision that he said, that you will all bow down before me. Remember that there was the two different visions? The second one talked about the sheaths of grain. Right? So what were they going down for? They were going down for grain. So the prophetic word wasn't only an object that was picked, it was actually talking about what they would actually bow down for. So this fulfilled that. So the sin of Hezron's grandfather Judah and his many great uncles led the nation of Israel into this tribulation. God's punishment had severe consequences. The promised land of the covenant no longer sustained them, the famine. God set Joseph apart for his divine purpose, so we need to understand that. And he gave Joseph dreams that were not only prophetic, but would cause their fulfillment to be activated by the sin of those he revealed them to, his brothers. God gives me a vision, and they're activated by the sin of somebody else in my life. Not the way that we would normally think, is it? So we're talking about how we sometimes feel that we're going downhill in life and things are coming against us, but often God's actually working. As we say, he works in mysterious ways because he's bringing things down a path where he knows that when we get to a certain point, things will shift and change, and then we'll start to come back up again. And this is what happened to these guys. So they needed to be unified in faith to become the future nation of Israel. The discord that already existed between the brothers and their disobedience to God caused them to be taken out of the promised land. That's the result. The famine was just an instrument. They were taken out of the covenant land of promise because they weren't entitled to inherit it at this point in time. They weren't fit to rule it. So this is how God dealt with it. So Hezron arrived in Egypt with his greater family, and in Genesis 46 verse 26 it says, all those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. So I mentioned this in that last week. So the males were 66 in number. So you can imagine, we mentioned this, the greater family would have been quite large, because there's all the wives and then there's all the servants. Right? So you can imagine there would be quite a number. I think we're talking, when we looked at it, with the number of servants for the size of the herds and all the rest of it, they would be numbered well over 1,000 people. Okay? Maid servants, men servants, all the rest of it, shepherds. He was the fourth generation born into the nation of Israel. Now a large family of people bound together by their move to a foreign land. And this move, of course, was orchestrated by the Father in heaven, who once wrestled with Hezron's great-grandfather Jacob and changed his name to Israel. So as said here, I've estimated that it's over 1,000, some say up to 2,000 that their number would have been when they count what they would require to look after all the livestock. And so as you can imagine, when we're looking at a parcel of land, we say, well, why the land of Goshen? They actually had to have an area that was considerable in size because they had to graze all of their livestock. They had to house all of the people that were actually there, so they couldn't go into just a very small space. So that would have been part of the consideration. God blessed the Israelites. The Bible tells us they were already wealthy as a people, but when they arrived in Egypt, they were given property in the best part of the land. And Joseph also, it says in Genesis 47 verse 12, Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all of his father's household with food according to the number of their children. So the Bible gives us paints quite a nice picture of what it would have been like. So Hezron, for example, he came from a bigger family. The Bible tells us that the generations that went down were more so than the other family members. So they would actually receive more from Joseph than the other families, for example. Excuse me. So God would have protected and provided for them all as they grew up in the land of Egypt. And like those before him, Hezron was brought up as a shepherd, tending the family's flocks. So all the way through the journey at this point in time, when we talk about occupation, the family were shepherds. You know, they're not just names, they're actually people, they're shepherds, and this is what they were actually doing. Under the rule of their great uncle Joseph, there was peace, and obviously the pharaoh had been growing up. There was a time of territorial expansion for Egypt. History tells us that they actually became greater. Why? Because the rest of the known world was submitted to them, because they were the one who had the store of grain. What do you do when you have to get grain? You have to give something for it. So what happens when your money runs out? You start giving land and property. So this is what happened at the time. Okay, so by dating, when Hezron had grown to a young man of estimated about 19 years of age, his great-grandfather Jacob knew that his time was short. They'd been living in this region of Goshen around Avaris for 17 years by this stage, and his great-grandfather was 147 years of age. And of course, this I've dated to 1688 BC. Obviously, this was the time when all the brothers went into the tent. Remember, they go in Genesis 49, and they go in to receive the blessing. They know he's going to pass away. So again, from Hezron, young boy, 19 years old, and he would have seen all the senior members of the family disappearing in the tent. They would have known there was something going on at that point in time. There would have been emotions, weeping, all the rest of it, and then they would have come out and told about Jacob's peaceful passing. In Genesis 52, it says, then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So we learn again that the fact that they're in the land of Egypt, not in the land of Canaan, so the customs are different. So when they die, they're now submitting to the customs of the land. So the Bible tells us this. So what would have happened? Some Egyptians would have come with a cart into the camp under the direction of Joseph. They would have carefully lifted his body and slowly drove it away. In Genesis 50 verses 2 to 3, it goes on to say, so the physicians embalmed him. So we know what happens in Egypt, what that means. Okay, so they had the canopic jars, right? They took out parts of the organs of the body, the brain, all this would have happened, and he would have been embalmed.
Didn't it also happen because Jacob made Joseph promise that he's going to take him back to the land of his father?
Correct. So that's what comes next.
That body wouldn't have survived that journey; it would have rotten. So that was the embalmment preserves the body, so he could be taken back.
It would have, but I think there's another thing that you're quite correct. But I think there's another thing again on top of that, and that's that they would have honoured him. He was the head of the family. Joseph rescued the Egyptian nation. They became wealthy as a nation because of what Joseph did. They took in his whole family and gave him the best of the land because of Joseph. So when Joseph's father passed away, the Egyptians would have honoured Joseph by honouring the father. Embalming, their beliefs obviously are different, but the actual process of embalming obviously would have preserved the body. But the fact is that Joseph remember, and then Joseph was an indentured slave in the country. He was still submitted to the authority of these people at this point in time. The Bible doesn't tell us that he ever became a free man. So to this embalming process, the thing that it displays to us, which I think we should take away from it, is that they're in the land of Egypt. Everything that's happening now is as the Egyptians actually do. So the greater picture is not just what's happening to the father, but the fact that all of these different things that were going on, the customs, the rituals, the ceremonies, the beliefs, the false gods, all of that is implied through this, that would have affected this particular grouping of people at this time. So just finishing that scripture, where was I? It says, so the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming, and the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. So the position is all from the Egyptians. The Egyptians embalmed him, the Egyptians mourned him, the Egyptians, this is the requirement by them. And so we find that this living in the land is being infused into their lives as well. So it says, when we first arrived in Egypt, so this is what you need to think about. When they first arrived in Egypt, what happened? They were detestable. They were put in the land of Goshen away from the people. And yet we find now that when the very people who were detestable, when Jacob dies, they're embalming him as one of their own. So there's something that's changed dramatically since they've been there, because there's got to have been some form of acceptance of them living there. Because if they were detestable, I can't imagine they'd be embalming them, observing the 70 days of mourning, etc. So we see quite a shift coming through that.
Apart, you also see that Jacob went, it tells us that he went and he blessed the Pharaoh.
Right.
I mean, I don't think the Pharaoh's going to allow anyone just to go and bless him. He's the one he's the God. He's supposed to bless everyone.
That's right.
But even the Pharaoh showed respect towards Jacob.
Right. And remember, the Pharaoh at the time, he was a little boy.
Yeah.
And he saw Jacob as this older man. So it's quite a rich story or understanding that we get from this. So when they first arrived in Egypt, the Egyptians wouldn't go near them. They detested and looked down upon them. They said we were shepherds and not to be mixed with. How things had changed. The honour and respect that Joseph had earned had opened the heart of the Egyptians, for they now mourned the father of Zaphnath like their own. So Hezron's grandfather, Judah, told his family members they were returning to the land of his birth to bury his great-grandfather. Genesis 50:13 says, they carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre, where Abraham had bought as a burial place. Another picture for you to have a look at. So this is taken from a typical royal procession, and so this is the colour, the glamour, what do you want to call it, the regentry. So in other words, they're carrying all the standards, all the Pharaoh's colours, because it wasn't just their people that went back, the Pharaoh sent people as well, as the Bible tells us. You can imagine Hezron though, as a child, here's his family, certain family members heading off with all this going on, and he's got to stay home and tend the flocks. No, you stay here, son, we've got to look after the animals. So he would have watched them all head off like this. So it says in Genesis 50 verses 7 to 9, it says, so Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court and all the dignitaries of Egypt, besides all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks, so this is all biblical what I'm saying, and the herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went with them. It was a very large company. So the Bible paints quite a picture, and that's what that picture I'm passing around, which I'll obviously put onto the YouTube video. Okay, any questions at this stage? So we're looking at everything around what's happening to sort of piece together the lives of these children at this point in time. So soon after Hezron's family returned to Egypt and settled down, there came another great loss in the land of Egypt, and news would quickly spread around. Of course, it was the Pharaoh who had died. So here we're talking about the great age of Abraham's family, and we find out that the pharaohs, as we mentioned, they don't live for very long. So historically we can find out all of that information. So Pharaoh Amenhotep I was succeeded by Thutmose I. So we end up with a new dynasty. What dynasty name comes out of the Bible from this? Thutmose I, Moses. Okay, so we end up with a new dynasty. There's a reason for this. When we examine history, we find that some of the families, they didn't have children. So somebody else would have to take over the reign, either won by war or appointed to a general or a vizier, someone that was important who had the capacity to rule. Joseph, Zaphnath-Paneah, he's there. What would have happened to him at this point in time? Did he continue as the governor of Egypt under the new pharaoh? So we go outside of the Bible here. So we're looking at history. So during the reign of Amenhotep I, the Bible tells us that Joseph governed Egypt in its entirety. During this time, many building projects were undertaken by an architect. So when we look at the history, there was an architect from an aristocratic family called Eneni. And Eneni had many other titles, and this is how we can sort of piece it together, because one of his titles was called the superintendent of the granaries. So Joseph's job, remember what Joseph's job was? He was there to provide the grain, he built the storehouses, so he was the guy who was overseeing all of this. We find out here that there's now a different person who's in charge of the granaries. He was also the superintendent of the royal buildings and superintendent of the workmen in the Karnak treasury. So Joseph's job, which was to govern, would have encapsulated all of these tasks, right? Because the pharaohs, they didn't do this stuff. The pharaohs were the head of the army. They didn't look after all the day-to-day running of the state. So when Thutmose I succeeded Amenhotep I as pharaoh, he retained the services, though history tells us that this same person was engaged to commence. And history tells us that they started carving out the Valley of the Kings. So we're all aware of the Valley of the Kings. What this spelt out, when they started to build out the Valley of the Kings, it was the end of the period of pyramids. There was no more pyramids from this point onwards. So here we are, I'm telling you that when Joseph was alive and these descendants, we go through this era of Egyptian history where the pyramids stop and they start to carve out this new way of burying their pharaohs. So this is that new era. So based on this historical information and alignment of the day, I'm basically making a point that it's probably unlikely that Joseph was still in that role. There's other people who had taken over this role. When we look at Joseph's age at this point in time, remember he started as a 17-year-old boy. It's estimated he's about 57 years old at this particular point in time. Now when we look at this particular pharaoh, we learn that Cush, which is today's Sudan, it had been under the dominance of the Egyptians since the time of Pharaoh Ahmose. This new pharaoh, Thutmose, he led an army to defeat them and basically expanded the kingdom of Egypt even further. And we find out later in history that some of the Egyptian pharaohs actually came from Cush. They were actually black men. They were no longer their particular tribes of people, if you will. So this ties in. And the Bible names some of these pharaohs, which we'll go into later on. It also tells you that this same pharaoh, because of their wealth and power, and the other countries were depleted from the famine, that apparently they went as far as Carchemish, right, on the other side of the Euphrates River in northern Mesopotamia, which is in today's Turkey. So it says they expanded their territories up to there. If you go to Israel today, you see that they controlled all the coastal route through the Jezreel Valley, past Beit Shean, up onto the northern plateau. So obviously they went up through there and they were active at this particular point in time. So under his reign, the Israelites obviously continued to live. The Bible says they didn't come out at this particular point in time, and so they were continuing to prosper. We can assume from this that obviously everything that Joseph had done, there would be no threat perceived. These people actually helped them to become wealthy and more powerful. So it would have been peaceful for them. So the favour of God through Joseph gave the pharaohs unprecedented power. So as I mentioned before in 1 Chronicles 2-9, Hezron fathered 3 sons by his wife. They were named Jeremiel, Ram and Caleb. Although seemingly unimportant, mentioned only by name, genealogy is an important part of the Bible, as I keep saying. Each of Hezron's sons were a fulfilment of God's promise to Abraham that he would have many descendants that would become a great nation. So it was from amongst them, of course, that the next son, Ram, was actually born. There's not huge stories for any of these, obviously. We can only look at the circumstances the Bible gives us around them and put together in context the history that joins with that to paint an actual picture of what was going on. So Pharaoh Thutmose, again, his reign did not last long. Apparently he was an older man, for he was not the son, as I mentioned, of Pharaoh Amenhotep I. So his period of rule came to an end, and he was succeeded by the next pharaoh of the same name, Thutmose II, who was born to a minor wife called Mutnefret. So this is all available in history. And of course he married his half-sister Hatshepsut to secure his entitlement to the throne. So they had to marry into these positions in order to take the throne. So often these were arranged things. They were not because they obviously loved somebody. Now historically, and I mentioned this last week, Pharaoh Thutmose only ruled briefly, and his life was cut short by disease because he only reached the age of 30. So today they examine all the mummies, they put them through scans, and apparently this guy was scarred and he was scabbed. So he had a skin disease all over his body. And it says that he fathered 2 children, a daughter called Neferu by Hatshepsut and a son called Thutmose III. And of course Thutmose III took over from Thutmose II. So we start sort of rolling through all these pharaohs because we find that they had all these diseases and they didn't last for very long. So you think about it, Joseph and his family is still alive, and we're going Pharaoh, Pharaoh, Pharaoh. There's a change of power. So all of a sudden what Joseph did and the influence of the family would have started to wane a little bit, because no longer was the story personal, they knew each other anymore, because that was something that happened back then. So we start to see a shift in the circumstances happened by the change of generations of the pharaoh. They're not the same family anymore either, they're a new dynasty. So following the death of this pharaoh, history tells us that Hatshepsut elevated herself to pharaoh. So here we have a female pharaoh. Right? This is not, there's no precedent for this, and it was something that was thought to be unthinkable. So Thutmose III, again, he was a child, apparently he was only 2 years of age, and so she ruled as a co-regent. So we see this repeat of their system happening. So during the years after Joseph stepped aside as governor, the ruling pharaoh had changed 3 times across a period of 17 years. Okay, so no longer was that personal relationship there. When Thutmose III matured, he served as an equal and headed up the armies until she died and became sole pharaoh. And history, of course, dates this at 1651. Hezron, it says, when he was older, he married the great granddaughter of Joseph. So in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 2:21, it tells us that he had a child by Machir, the father of Gilead. He had married her when he was 60 years old, and she bore him Segub. So we see again that these people are prosperous and living longer, and the people who are ruling over them are obviously wealthy, but they don't live for very long. So we see this difference between God's blessing on them in terms of their age as well. So this stage, because we've got this union between Joseph's family and Hezron, we have to probably assume that Joseph has now perhaps moved back with his family, because it tells you when Joseph passed away that he asked for his bones to be taken back as well, right? So at some point in time he would have had to have gone back to the land of Goshen. So this union, this marriage, sort of ties into the evidence that they would have come together at some point in time. So he was 60 years old at this point in time when his father Segub and died before the arrival of his son Asher. It's reasonable to assume that Hezron almost certainly died sometime in his 60s. The son that was born was of that name, Asher. Okay, I think that's it for Hezron. Okay, so we're going to this picture here. to sort of bring proof. This is a picture of the pharaoh. Now, they actually don't know whether that's actually Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, or Thutmose the son. So it's identified to that period, but they don't know which one. Obviously, the fact that it's just a stone carving doesn't give them enough detail. So, but they're from that historical period. Okay, so we're going to finish off with Ram. So he's only mentioned by name in the genealogical lists as well, provided in 1 Chronicles again, in Ruth again, and in Matthew again. He's one of the first generation of Israelites born in Egypt who were fruitful and multiplied, as Exodus 1:7 says. So knowing that Hezron fathered Ram by his first wife and that he fathered 2 more children later after the age of 60 by his second wife, we can sort of get an idea of the birth of Ram. Because the Bible doesn't give us these details anymore, so we're sort of looking between the lines of all the different descendants. He's the second child born to his father Hezron. So he was born during the rule of this pharaoh Thutmose III, we assume. As a young child, shared his reign with his stepmother, as I've mentioned. And in Egypt, she was known, and this is part of the identity problem with the statue, is she was known as king or pharaoh because they don't have a female word. There wasn't a different word given to a female pharaoh. Okay, so Ram grew up in a peaceful and prosperous period of time. So again, we're still at peace at this point in time. This pharaoh, it says, expanded the trade routes and the networks to the neighbours in both the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Red Sea to the south. And it's a period of prolific building works again with the same architect. It says that she wasn't long-lived either, for she died in her prime middle years. And when they examined the mummy, they discovered that she showed signs of diabetes, bone cancer, bad teeth and arthritis. So once again, all these problems that brought their lives to a short end. So after her death, Pharaoh Thutmose III became the sole ruler of Egypt. And during this period of time, he was known to be a formidable warrior. And he took over the command of the armies, and this stood him in good stead, because history tells us that after Pharaoh Hatshepsut died, Assyria, so we start going into some of the areas of the Bible, who had been a vassal state of the Egyptians since the reign of Thutmose I, they rebelled and then became their own empire. So we get into the point where we see the beginning of the first Assyrian empire kicking at this point in time. So we've got new names starting to come which are familiar later in the Bible. At this point in time, because of the Bible, it gives us dating around Moses, starts talking about family members. In the period of his reign, he conducted 17 known military campaigns and captured 350 cities apparently. The second pharaoh to cross the Euphrates River, and he conquered most of the Near East and southwards into Nubia, today's northern Sudan. So in the Bible, at Genesis 50 verses 22 to 24, it says, Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. It's interesting, if you actually listen to what Joseph said, it says, but God will surely come to your aid. So Joseph knows something. Joseph's relationship with God was obviously very real, right? Because he's really saying to them, you're not going home because God's going to come to your aid. That means something's going to have to happen, something's going to change, something's going to go wrong perhaps. And so he gives us this pretty much a prophetic word to his brothers when he says that surely God will come to your aid. So these are his part of his words. So it's a bit foreboding what he actually imparted to his brothers. And then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. And then the Bible tells us that he died at the age of 110. And then we come to this point in time in the Bible here where we can't really determine a lot of the ages of the brothers, but they were all going to be dying around a similar point of time. Joseph was the youngest, remember?
Yeah.
So all the other brothers, they must have already started to pass away,
Yeah.
or they would have been passing away at a similar point in time. So when we're in the story of Ram, right, who's now the 4th generation after Judah, we would find that Joseph and all his brothers, they're probably either passed away or they're just about to pass away by the time we get to this generation. So that tells us that all of that period of prosperity where God's hand was on Joseph and the protection of his people and making them prosperous, it's now become distant history. Right? The pharaohs have changed hands, they've changed dynasty. So this portrays this picture because the Bible soon turns a corner and it starts to tell us how the Egyptians got upset with them. They said that they're too many in number and they were too wealthy and that they needed to subjugate themselves. So,
But it's also very interesting here that they say they only put Moses in a coffin. They
Yes.
didn't mention anything that him being moved.
right.
Only when Moses moved the Israelites out of Egypt, then they took Moses'
picked him
bones
up.
with them.
So Joseph's bones.
Joseph's bones.
That's
with
right,
them.
that's correct.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I'll go into that later. There's actually a settlement which has been found, and it tells you the region where they lived, and it tells you the pathway by which they came out, because they came out through Succoth and Pithom, and so and a place called Edith, if my memory serves me correctly. So basically, you can sort of trace which way they actually came out when they left, and they had to pick up his coffin somewhere along that line, right? The Bible tells us that he was buried to the east of the Nile. Okay, so they actually found I'll show you a picture later, no one can verify it's the coffin, but they found an outer sarcophagi with an inner sarcophagi which would have only been built for somebody who was of a royal birth or a high dignitary, and they found it in this particular town to the east. And so we have a picture of it. It's empty, but they found this picture of it. So it's quite extraordinary. Perhaps it's the one, perhaps it's not.
Yeah.
But it fits the picture of what they... And of course these things are unearthed today, because in the past no one took any notice on them, they're all buried and all the rest of it, so it's all changed. So at this point in time during Ram's life, because we're just finishing off with Ram, it says that he lived through this 3rd change of Pharaoh. So in the latter years of Pharaoh Tutmos III, he started to prepare his son to rule Egypt, and his son was called Amenhotep II, so the name has gone back to this other name, and he entered a period of co-rule, so that was normal. You know, when one was getting older, or knew they were unwell, they would bring the other one alongside them, and they would start to learn how to hold the reins. And it says that he was 18 years of age when he became sole ruler. So this period of peace and prosperity in Egypt, the Israelites enjoyed under the protection of Joseph, is now about to come to an end. So